Why, hello there. It is 49 days until Shadow of the Erdtree comes out, and our Elden Wait has been blessed with a new interview. On April 26th, a few Chinese outlets, including IGN, posted new Shadow of the Erdtree interview with Miyazaki, linked below. This interview retreads some previous information that we heard from Miyazaki's interview back in February. I go more in depth into that interview from these videos, also linked below, and I'll quickly retread them here, but we've got some new nuggets of information for us to dive into. Let's get into it. I'm going to follow the IGN interview question order, but I've synthesized the information between the various articles to try and get the full picture. I use DeepL and occasionally other sources for translations for the interview, and I will show those on screen. The interview starts with asking why From Software chose to tell the story of Shadow of the Erdtree with a single large DLC. This isn't really new information, but the story of Elden Ring is based on the mythos constructed by George R.R. Martin, and this content is actually part of George R.R. Martin's mythos and didn't fit into the base game, so Miyazaki tells us that they developed it for the DLC. The interviewers then ask, you said that the plot of the DLC was set up by George R. R. Martin a long time ago, so as the actual content developed more than expected, the DLC has been in development for a long time. And Miyazaki answered that the DLC has taken a long time, and thanks everyone for their patience. But in return, he says that the DLC is big enough, and says that Elden Ring is a huge world, and that the DLC will carry on in that tradition with a unique experience where players can freely adventure, explore, and challenge powerful enemies with surprise discoveries. Basically, Elden Ring is a huge world and the DLC is a microcosm of that experience. And continuing sort of on the same topic, they said that in the past that there's been multiple DLCs. Why was Shadow of the Erdtree decided to be one big installment? And Miyazaki answered basically that this isn't new information, but he said that they wanted one big DLC instead of multiple smaller ones because that's the best way to emphasize exploration and adventure. If they divided it up, it would divide up sort of that big, meaty open world experience, and they didn't want to do that, which makes a lot of sense. Next, the interviewers asked basically, what is the difficulty of the DLC and how are they dealing with players who have end game gear and have beaten the game and are going in fully equipped? This isn't really new information either. Miyazaki explains that the difficulty is basically equivalent to the second half of Elden Ring, and that, as mentioned before, there's a difficulty system in the DLC featuring this new attribute where high-level players or players who really want to challenge can forgo upgrading this new attribute to keep things as they are, or players who want to adjust the difficulty can upgrade it to become stronger in the DLC. So it's sort of this optional diegetic in-game difficulty slider system of some kind. And it sounds like it's kind of like the Giant Souls and Vendrick in Dark Souls 2, where it gets easier to damage him the more Giant Souls you have, but sort of on a DLC wide level. Something along those lines. This is not new information, this was previously discussed and you can see my videos on the channel talking about that. Next, they ask what sort of new weapons and magic and stuff will there be, what new content will be in the DLC, and Miyazaki answered this isn't a new question either, but he responded that there's 8 new weapon types, and through looking at the trailer and stuff in the previous interview, we learned that there will be dueling shields, martial arts weapons, reverse grip swords, thrown weapons, and the Odachi from the previous interview. So there's still 3 weapon types that aren't known. What do you think those might be? Please leave me your guess in the comments. Next, they asked how long is it expected to take to beat the DLC, and what's the recommendation for going into the DLC. And Miyazaki gave a funny answer here where basically he won't tell us the length because back before Elden Ring released, people asked how long it would take to beat the game. He said 30 hours, and people were freaking out about that. And so it's probably a good idea that he's not really giving a number here, but he previously asserted that Shadow of the Erdtree's size is roughly equivalent to Limgrave, and that already got people freaking out, so I think it's best to leave it a little ambiguous for now. And his reasoning is that as a developer, he's played the game a lot, and it's hard to give that fresh player experience for how long it might take. Personally, from the trailer, seeing the world and the verticality and the density of the map, I think we are in good hands. As mentioned, From Software is explicitly trying to make a denser open world experience with more blurred lines between the legacy dungeons and the open world, so I wouldn't worry about the amount of content. I think it'll be great, and there's no reason to worry about numbers or size going into it because it's ultimately about the quality of the experience, and I'm feeling very confident that it will deliver. Next, they asked how DLC would go with the New Game Plus, and Miyazaki responded that the DLC will follow your standard New Game Plus difficulty scaling. This isn't something like Chalice Dungeons and Bloodborne where they're independent of the New Game Plus cycle. It will follow just like the main game, where enemies' health and such gets higher and more difficult depending on which New Game cycle you're in. Next, Miyazaki was asked if Shadow of the Erdtree is the only DLC planned, and if not, if there's any sequels in the works or anything else that can be revealed. This isn't really new information, but Miyazaki restated that this is the only DLC planned, and there's currently no plans for a sequel, but they're not closing that door. They're leaving the option open, and Miyazaki can't really come out and say if they are thinking of making a sequel, especially if they haven't started it yet. So it's a pretty fair answer. I don't know what else he would be able to say at that point. However, I will say that From Software did purchase the Elden Ring IP from Bamco to own it outright, so I'd be surprised if they didn't make a return to it in the future or do more with it, but it doesn't seem like that's what they're currently working on now, which is exciting for me because I'm always excited for what new stuff From Software is doing, and we'll look forward to Elden Ring down the road as a pretty good possibility, I'd say. Miyazaki was then asked that if there is a sequel, what story would he like to tell? Does he have anything in mind for an Elden Ring sequel? And basically, Miyazaki isn't saying shit. Like, he said that usually he creates the story as he's working on the game, and he's not working on the game as they just explained. So there's too many variables to really give an answer, and if he said anything now, it may change through development anyways, so he's not saying anything. Next, they asked if the Shadow of the Erdtree would address some of the mysteries in the game, and if there will be more mysteries and stuff to dig into with the DLC. And Miyazaki responded that some mysteries from the main game will be answered, and there'll be a deeper understanding of the plot of the game. I think he's being a bit humble here, because he says that he can't really say what will make for more content to discuss and dig deeper on, but we know there's going to be stuff to dig into. We know there will be some juicy stuff. And I would just add here that I'd not expect the DLC to answer questions people have in a straightforward way necessarily, or have it be definitive. Miyazaki's ethos when it comes to storytelling is wanting players to make connections and sort of figure out the story and the experience for themselves, and I think that's still going to be part of it. This isn't going to be some kind of exposition dump. Miyazaki was then asked about the promotional image for Shadow of the Erdtree, where there's a broken shadow tree and there's a lot of the baldachin, the current-like things appearing around it, and they asked about the meaning of that and why do the curtains disappear at the end of the trailer. And Miyazaki basically confirms that when we see that scene of Mikola at the end with his hand raised, that there are no curtains there. And that's basically confirming that there will be some kind of world state change and that the curtains will disappear. And if I was to guess, I would say that this is something at the end of the DLC where the curtains coming down could mean that the Land of Shadow is now visible in the lands between, not necessarily reachable, but visible now because it was obscured, as Miyazaki talked about in the previous interview. And Miyazaki also says here that the broken shadow tree visualizes that this is a corrupted world that is gradually collapsing, which is an interesting bit of new information just about what it's supposed to represent about the world, and it's corrupted and collapsing. It's interesting what's causing it to collapse. Is it what Mesmer is doing? Was it, something that happened with the shattering of the Elden Ring? We don't know yet, but it'll be interesting to find out. And the next question is basically, will there be new factions in the DLC, and will factions from the main game return in the DLC? You're talking like Two Fingers, Carrions, the various groups that are in the world, the Golden Order, of course, all that stuff. And Miyazaki, of course, says yes, there will be new factions, and existing factions will have an influence in the DLC, and that we'll get more information about existing groups. And if I was to guess, I think there's a pretty good bet that groups like the Newman, which America is a Newman, they've come from somewhere else, the lands between, and then also the Misbegotten or the Crucible Touch, like the Omen, that they will get some more information in the DLC. And then also we've seen hints of something with the Astrologers or the Carrions, so I think those are all existing factions that we may see more about in Shadow of the Erdtree. Next, Miyazaki is asked about the prerequisites to defeat Mohg and Radahn before going into the DLC, and they're asking, is there a reason why you have to defeat Radahn? It's easier to understand why you need to defeat Mohg, but why Radahn? And this isn't really new information. Miyazaki said that we'll understand why Radahn needs to be defeated before going into the DLC when we play it, and as discussed when the previous interview came out and this information came to light, I think it has to do most likely with Radahn halting the stars and holding back fate, and that still seems likely to be the reason, but there could always be a more involved reason when we get into the DLC, but I still think that's most likely. Miyazaki was then asked if there's any plans with the DLC to sort of revamp the body of the main game, or do anything with the story in the main game, how that will affect it. And Miyazaki said that there will be no changes to the story of the main game through the DLC. He doesn't really say anything about non-story elements like enemy placement, but I don't think that's very likely based off of how he's responding. I don't think this is going to be like a Scholar of the First Sin situation where it meaningfully changes geometry and enemies out in the world of the main game. The next question is, will the DLC feature NPCs from the main game, and will new NPCs from the DLC appear in the main game as well? And Miyazaki said that the separation of the DLC from the main game is in part to separate the DLC characters from the main game, basically to avoid any instances where a character dying in one place would affect the story in the other. So you don't want the DLC characters and that narrative to be affected by them being in the main world, and you don't want main characters from the main game to be in the DLC and have something in that complicate the narrative of the main game. He does say that indirectly known characters like Miquella will be in the DLC though, so we may get to meet some other names mentioned in the main game of Elden Ring, but that we haven't met as an NPC yet. In the next question, Miyazaki is basically asked, will the DLC and the endings of the main game have any relationship to each other, anything new? Will which ending you choose affect anything in the DLC? And to all that, Miyazaki says no. They also ask as part of this question if the DLC has multiple endings, to which Miyazaki also says no, but that there will be decisions that you will make over the course of the DLC, which will sort of make for your own version of the story, even if the ending, quote unquote, of the DLC is essentially the same. I see this as something like the old Hunters, where the DLC fleshed out the existing story of Bloodborne, but it has its own narrative, and it's not something where the player actions really change what the DLC is about narratively in the story, but within there's some decisions you can make which create your own experience. The next question asked is basically, hey, we see that St. Trina's Lily and Miquella's Lily are kind of similar. Are we going to get more stuff about St. Trina in the DLC? To which Miyazaki confirms that St. Trina will be in the DLC, and that the relationship between Miquella and St. Trina will be further explored in the DLC. As we know from cut content and still with the main game, it's heavily implied and then kind of confirmed in cut content that Miquella and St. Trina are like different aspects of the same person. So we don't know if that is still true necessarily, but there is some relationship still intact based on this, and it will be explored, so that's pretty exciting. The next question asks basically their take on Souls games, saying that since Demon Souls came out, there's been a lot of Souls games that aren't produced by From Software. Has Miyazaki tried them? How does he feel about them? And Miyazaki says that From Software and him have never really defined Souls, in that when they were making Demon Souls, they were following the trends of the time and trying to make a good game, which I would say Demon Souls is in many ways, and this is well argued by many people, that Demon Souls and Dark Souls were sort of bucking the sort of cinematic trend and sort of referring back to sort of older games where there was a little bit less concern about tutorializing stuff, and that's sort of where the opacity and the appeal of these games comes from. So I think he's being a little humble there, and he also says that he loves playing a lot of similar types of games to what they produce, and thinks that developers should work together and learn from each other to bring players better gaming experiences. Which I don't think is a huge revelation, but I think is great to hear. And, I think that sort of influence, they should take things from stuff like Lies of P and bring that into their stuff and continue to inspire each other, because at the end they're all action RPGs with a certain sensibility, and I think that all sounds great. Finally, Miyazaki is asked to say something to the players who are looking forward to the game. Remember, these are Chinese outlet interviews, and Miyazaki says that they didn't develop Elden Ring for a certain culture, and that he's really glad Chinese players are so supportive of the game. And, that seems true to me. Elden Ring pulls from so many cultures, while Dark Souls is very Western. You got Sekiro is Japanese. I think Elden Ring, while having that Western fantasy bent, is really pulling from so many cultural inspirations that I don't think in the same degree Dark Souls is sort of a Japanese take on Western fantasy. Elden Ring is a bit broader than that. So there you have it, Miyazaki's interviews with IGN and other Chinese outlets as they're beginning to promote the game. I'm hoping we see more and more. At the time of recording this audio, there could be another Elden Ring tweet going up. I'll see if I get to. I'll include it at the end of this video to discuss it, but I like to see that they're starting to get the marketing train going as we go into May here. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and I'm going to continue doing Elden Ring content, especially as we get more information, get closer to the DLC, and of course when the DLC releases. So make sure to subscribe if you haven't. Turning on that bell lets you know when videos go up, which have been a little sporadic lately, so that'll help keep you informed when I'm uploading something new. But really, thanks for watching, and I look forward to hanging out with y'all in the Land of Shadow in a bit less than a couple months. So thanks for watching.